The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic and straightened his towering bearskin hat. At 28 years old, Mitchell had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, a position that demanded unwavering discipline, perfect posture, and absolute silence while on duty. His dark eyes scanned the growing crowd of tourists gathering behind the ornate iron gates, their cameras already clicking away at the spectacle of British tradition. Mitchell had earned his place among the elite guards through years of rigorous training with the Grenadier Guards Regiment. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches, his imposing figure cut an impressive silhouette against the palace's grand facade. The scarlet tunic, adorned with gleaming brass buttons and intricate gold braiding, had been pressed to perfection. His black trousers bore a sharp crease that could cut paper, and his polished boots reflected the morning light like mirrors. Every detail of his appearance spoke to the centuries-old tradition he represented. The tourists pressed closer to the barriers, their excitement palpable as they witnessed one of London's most famous attractions. Children pointed in wonder at the motionless figure, while adults whispered theories about whether the guards were real people or elaborate statues. Mitchell had heard it all before during his countless hours of duty. The speculation, the jokes, the attempts to make him laugh or move. It was all part of the daily routine he had learned to tune out completely. Among the crowd, a family from Ohio had positioned themselves directly in front of Mitchell's post. The father, Brad Thompson, a heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a loud Hawaiian shirt and baseball cap, seemed particularly amused by the guard's stillness. His wife, Sarah, tried to shush their 2 teenage children, who were already making faces and silly gestures at Mitchell, hoping for any reaction. The family had saved for 2 years to afford this European vacation, and Brad was determined to get his money's worth from every tourist attraction. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger and more boisterous. Tour guides led groups past the guards, explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard, while tourists snapped photos and recorded videos. Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing controlled and measured. This was more than just standing still. It was a meditation in discipline, a testament to military precision that had been honed over generations. The Queen's Guard tradition dated back to 1660, and Mitchell took pride in being part of this unbroken chain of service. These weren't costume performers or actors. They were active duty soldiers who had proven themselves in training and often in combat. Many of his fellow guards had served tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones. The ceremonial duties were just one aspect of their military service, and the discipline required was genuine and hard-earned. Brad Thompson, however, saw only a man in a funny costume playing dress-up for tourists. He nudged his wife and pointed at Mitchell with a smirk. "Look at this guy," he said loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Must be nice getting paid to stand around and do nothing all day. I bet he can't even move in that ridiculous outfit." His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his words. Sarah Thompson felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She had read about the Queen's Guard before their trip and knew these were real soldiers, not performers. "Brad, maybe we should just take our pictures and move on," she suggested quietly, tugging at his sleeve. But her husband was already warming up, emboldened by the chuckles from other American tourists who found his commentary entertaining. The morning shift change was still 2 hours away, and Mitchell settled into the mental zone he had perfected over years of guard duty. He focused on his breathing, on the feeling of the ground beneath his feet, on the weight of his rifle. The tourists' voices became white noise, a meaningless backdrop to his meditation. He thought about his girlfriend, Emma, who was finishing her nursing degree back in Yorkshire. He thought about his younger brother, who was considering joining the army. He thought about anything except the growing agitation he could sense from the loud American tourist directly in front of him. Other guards had warned him about tourists like this, the ones who seemed to take the guards' silence as permission to push boundaries. They usually started with harmless jokes and comments, but some escalated when they didn't get the reaction they wanted. Mitchell had witnessed such incidents before, and had seen how quickly situations could spiral out of control when tourists mistook military discipline for weakness. The palace security cameras captured every angle of the courtyard, and Mitchell knew that his conduct was being monitored not just by tourists but by his superiors. Any break in protocol, any reaction to provocation could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from the prestigious position. The Queen's Guard was expected to maintain dignity and composure under all circumstances, representing not just the monarchy, but the entire British military. As the crowd continued to grow, Mitchell noticed other guards at their respective posts around the palace grounds. Each stood with the same perfect posture, the same unwavering focus, the same commitment to duty that had made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. They were brothers in arms united by their shared dedication to excellence and service. Whatever was about to unfold, Mitchell knew he could count on their support and understanding. The morning was still young, and already Mitchell could sense that this would not be an ordinary day of guard duty. The American tourist's voice was getting louder, his comments more pointed, and the crowd was beginning to take notice. Mitchell remained motionless, but every instinct honed by years of military training was telling him to prepare for something that would test every aspect of his discipline and professionalism. In the distance, the changing of the guard ceremony was being prepared, but that was still hours away. Until then, Mitchell would stand his post, protect his position, and uphold the honor of the Queen's Guard, no matter what challenges the day might bring. The sun climbed higher in the London sky as more tourists gathered around Sergeant Mitchell's post. What had started as a typical morning crowd was now becoming something more intense, more focused on the interaction between the American family and the stoic guard. Brad Thompson seemed to feed off the attention, his voice growing louder and his comments more pointed with each passing minute. "I'm telling you, Sarah, this has got to be the easiest job in the world," Brad announced, adjusting his baseball cap and pulling out his phone to record. "Just stand there like a statue and collect a paycheck. Hell, I could do this job with my eyes closed." His teenage son Kyle laughed and moved closer to the barrier, mimicking Mitchell's rigid posture in an exaggerated, mocking way. Mitchell's training kicked in automatically. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to separate his personal feelings from his professional duties. The American's ignorant comments stung, but they were nothing compared to what he had endured during his military training. Drill. Sergeants had screamed in his face for hours. Fellow soldiers had tested his resolve under extreme conditions, and he had learned to maintain his composure under pressures that would break most civilians. But this situation was different. This wasn't training or even combat. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate him in front of hundreds of witnesses, to reduce his service and sacrifice to a joke for someone's entertainment. The weight of his rifle felt heavier in his hands, not from physical strain but from the enormous self-control required to remain motionless while his honor was being attacked. Sarah Thompson continued to tug at her husband's arm, her discomfort growing more apparent with each of his loud pronouncements. "Brad, please. People are staring," she whispered urgently. She had noticed other tourists looking uncomfortable with her husband's behavior, and she could see British families in the crowd shaking their heads disapprovingly. Their daughter Madison, 16 and acutely aware of social embarrassment, had moved several steps away from her father, pretending not to be related to him. "Let them stare," Brad replied, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This is what we paid good money to see, right? A grown man playing dress-up soldier. I bet he's never even been in a real fight." He laughed at his own joke, completely oblivious to the historical significance of the uniform Mitchell wore or the combat experience that many Queen's Guards possessed. An elderly British gentleman, standing nearby, finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me, sir, but you're being quite disrespectful. These guards are real soldiers who have served their country with distinction." His words were measured but firm, and several other tourists nodded in agreement. Brad turned toward the stranger with a dismissive wave. "Oh, come on, Gramps, this is all just tourist theater. These guys are probably actors hired by the palace to stand around and look pretty for the cameras." His ignorance was stunning in its completeness, and Mitchell found himself fighting not just to remain still but to control the surge of anger that threatened to break through his professional composure. The crowd was definitely taking sides now. Most of the British tourists and many international visitors were clearly uncomfortable with Brad's behavior, while a few other Americans seemed amused by his commentary. The situation was becoming a Cultural clash played out in front of one of Britain's most sacred symbols of tradition and service. Mitchell's mind wandered briefly to his grandfather, who had served as a Queen's Guard in the 1960s. The old man had told him stories about the honor of the position, about the pride that came with representing the crown and the country. His grandfather had faced his own challenges during his service: protests during the turbulent 60s, tourists who thought the guards were merely decorative, politicians who questioned the value of maintaining such traditions. But he had persevered, maintaining his dignity and upholding the standards that made the Queen's Guard legendary. The temperature was rising, both literally and figuratively. Mitchell could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform, but his training had prepared him for far worse conditions. He had stood guard in scorching heat and bitter cold, through rain and snow, through celebrations and protests. Physical discomfort was just another variable to be managed and overcome. Brad Thompson was warming to his theme now, apparently encouraged by the attention he was receiving. "I mean, look at that hat," he said, pointing directly at Mitchell's bearskin. "That thing's probably got fleas or something. And that red coat? Looks like something from a high school marching band. No wonder the British lost their empire if this is what their army looks like." The insult to Britain itself crossed a line that even some of the American tourists found offensive. A woman from Texas stepped forward and addressed Brad directly. "Sir, I think you've said quite enough. These men deserve our respect, not our ridicule." Her words carried a stern authority that momentarily silenced Brad's commentary, but the damage was already done. The confrontation had drawn the attention of palace security, who were now monitoring the situation more closely. Mitchell could sense their presence without looking, could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere that indicated his superiors were aware of the developing situation. Any reaction from him now would be witnessed and documented, potentially ending his career in disgrace. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell that he was being attacked for the very discipline and professionalism that made him excellent at his job. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to maintain his composure in the face of provocation, to put duty above personal feelings. These were the qualities that had earned him his position among the Queen's Guard. Yet to the ignorant tourist, these same qualities appeared to be weaknesses to be exploited. Kyle Thompson, emboldened by his father's example, began making increasingly ridiculous faces at Mitchell, contorting his features and making exaggerated military salutes. His sister Madison finally spoke up, her voice tight with embarrassment. "Kyle, stop it, you're being an idiot." But her brother was too caught up in the moment to listen to reason. The morning that had started with such promise was now becoming a test of everything Mitchell believed in, everything he had trained for, everything that made him a professional soldier. The real question wasn't whether he could remain motionless. He had proven that countless times. The question was whether he could maintain his dignity and the honor of his position while being systematically humiliated by someone who had no understanding of what service and sacrifice really meant. The confrontation reached a new level when Brad Thompson decided that verbal harassment wasn't enough. He began to move closer to the barrier that separated tourists from the guard, his phone held high to capture what he clearly believed would be entertaining footage for his social media followers back home. The crowd sensed the escalation and grew quieter, watching with a mixture of fascination and horror as the situation spiraled toward something more serious. "I bet this guy can't even hear us," Brad announced loudly, now standing directly against the barrier just a few feet from Mitchell. "These hats probably cover their ears completely. We could be talking about anything and he wouldn't know." He gestured broadly, his movements becoming more animated as he played to his growing audience of uncomfortable spectators. Mitchell could hear every word with crystal clarity. The bearskin hat, while certainly imposing and ceremonial, didn't impair his hearing in the slightest. Every insult, every mocking comment, every attempt at humiliation registered clearly in his mind. But his training ran deeper than physical. Discipline. It was psychological armor that had been forged. Through years of military service and countless hours of ceremonial duty, Sarah Thompson had given up trying to control her husband's behavior and was now focused on damage control. She positioned herself between Brad and the other tourists, offering apologetic smiles and muttered explanations about jet lag and vacation stress. But even she could see that her husband's actions were moving beyond mere rudeness into something more troubling. The palace security team had definitely taken notice now. 2 officers in plain clothes had positioned themselves strategically in the crowd, close enough to intervene if necessary, but distant enough to avoid escalating the situation unnecessarily. They knew from experience that most tourist incidents resolve themselves without requiring official intervention, but they were prepared to act if Brad Thompson crossed certain lines. "You know what I think?" Brad continued, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I think this whole thing is a scam. These aren't real soldiers at all. They're probably just unemployed actors trying to make a few pounds standing around in costumes. Real soldiers would have some backbone, some fight in them. This guy's probably never held a real weapon in his life." The comment about real weapons struck particularly deep. Mitchell had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards, had seen combat that Brad Thompson couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. The rifle he held wasn't a prop. It was a functional weapon carried by a trained soldier. His medals weren't costume jewelry. They were earned through service and sacrifice that went far beyond anything most people would ever understand. An elderly veteran in the crowd, recognizable by his regimental tie and bearing, stepped forward with obvious anger. "Young man, you're speaking about things you clearly don't understand. These guards are serving soldiers who have earned their positions through merit and dedication. Your ignorance is showing, and it's embarrassing to watch." Brad turned to face the veteran with a dismissive sneer. "Oh, what, are you part of this act too, old-timer? Let me guess. You were probably one of these toy soldiers back in the day, standing around playing dress-up while real men did the actual fighting." The insult to a veteran struck the crowd like a physical blow, and several people audibly gasped at the depth of disrespect. Mitchell felt something shift inside him. Insulting him was one thing. He was trained to absorb that kind of treatment and had experienced far worse during his military career. But insulting a veteran, dismissing the service and sacrifice of previous generations of soldiers, crossed a line that went beyond personal attack into an assault on everything he held sacred. The veteran's face flushed red with anger, but before he could respond, other crowd members began to speak up. A young British woman with her children stepped forward. "Sir, you need to stop this right now. You're teaching your children that it's acceptable to mock people who serve their country. Is that really the lesson you want them to learn?" Brad's teenage daughter, Madison, was now visibly crying with embarrassment, her face buried in her hands as she realized that her father's behavior was being recorded by multiple tourists and would likely end up on social media. "Dad, please, just stop," she pleaded, but her words fell on deaf ears. Kyle Thompson, feeding off his father's energy, decided to escalate things further. "Hey, statue man," he called out to Mitchell. "Can you even move in that outfit? I bet you're stuck like that." He began making exaggerated movements, flailing his arms and jumping around in a cruel parody of military bearing. The security officers moved closer, their hands now resting near their communication devices. They had protocols for dealing with disruptive tourists, but they preferred to let situations resolve naturally when possible. However, Brad Thompson's behavior was approaching the threshold that would require intervention, and they were prepared to act quickly if necessary. Mitchell's breathing remained controlled and measured, but internally he was fighting a battle that went to the core of his identity as a soldier. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond, wanted to defend not just himself but the honor of his regiment, his country, and the veteran who had spoken up for him. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. He represented something larger than himself, something that couldn't be compromised by momentary anger or wounded pride. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the heat inside his heavy uniform was becoming more noticeable. Sweat trickled down his back. But Mitchell had endured far worse conditions during training and deployment. Physical discomfort was manageable. The assault on his dignity and the dignity of his fellow soldiers was far more challenging to bear. Brad Thompson seemed to interpret the crowd's growing disapproval as encouragement rather than condemnation. "See, I told you this was all fake. If this guy was a real soldier, he would have said something by now. Real soldiers don't just stand there and take abuse like this." His complete misunderstanding of military discipline and the requirements of ceremonial duty was breathtaking in its ignorance. The situation had reached a critical point. The crowd was now clearly divided between those horrified by Brad's behavior and those who seemed to find it entertaining. The security officers were positioned for intervention. The veteran was struggling to control his anger, and Mitchell was facing the greatest test of his professional discipline and personal character. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but potentially the future of Mitchell's career, and the reputation of the Queen's Guard itself. The weight of tradition, duty, and honor pressed down on his shoulders as he prepared for whatever challenge was coming next. The moment that changed everything came when Brad Thompson made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Emboldened by what he perceived as complete passivity from the guard, and encouraged by the attention from the crowd, he decided to cross the physical barrier that separated tourists from the ceremonial area. With his phone still recording, he ducked under the rope and took several steps toward Mitchell, bringing himself within arm's reach of the motionless soldier. "Let's see how committed this guy really is to his little act," Brad announced to his impromptu audience, his voice carrying a cruel edge that made several tourists step back in alarm. "I bet if I get close enough, he'll break character and tell me to back off." He moved even closer, now standing just inches from Mitchell's right side, his presence a clear violation of both protocol and common sense. The security officers immediately began moving through the crowd, their casual surveillance now transformed into urgent intervention, but they were positioned too far away to prevent what was about to happen. And Brad Thompson was too caught up in his performance to notice the rapidly approaching consequences of his actions. Mitchell felt the man's presence like a physical weight. Every instinct trained through years of military service screamed at him to respond to the threat, to protect his position, and maintain the security of his post. The tourist's proximity violated every protocol and represented a potential security breach that could not be tolerated. Yet still he remained motionless, his discipline holding firm even as the situation spiraled completely out of control. "Look at this," Brad continued, now addressing his phone camera as much as the crowd. "I'm standing right next to him and he's still pretending to be a statue. This is definitely fake, folks. No real security guard would let someone get this close." He reached out as if to touch Mitchell's uniform, and that gesture triggered a response that no amount of discipline could suppress. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Mitchell's head snapped toward Brad with military precision, his eyes blazing with controlled fury that made the tourist stumble backward in shock. "Stand back!" The command erupted from Mitchell's throat with the full authority of 6 years of military training and generations of ceremonial tradition. The voice was not human conversation, it was a force of nature, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the palace itself. Brad Thompson's face went white as he found himself staring into the eyes of a soldier who had seen combat, who had been trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force, who represented the disciplined power of the British military. The playful tourist game had suddenly become something deadly serious, and Brad realized with crystal clarity that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Get back now!" Mitchell's second command was even more forceful, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard and silencing every conversation, every camera click, every whispered comment. The crowd froze as they witnessed the awesome power of military authority unleashed in defense of duty and honor. Sarah Thompson screamed her husband's name as he stumbled backward, nearly falling over the barrier in his haste to escape Mitchell's blazing stare. The children pressed against their mother. Kyle's earlier bravado completely evaporated as he faced the reality of what his father had provoked. Madison continued to sob, now understanding that their family vacation had become an international incident that would follow them for years to come. The security officers reached the scene within seconds, but the immediate threat had already been neutralized by Mitchell's response. Brad stood trembling behind the barrier, his phone forgotten in his hand, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. The soldier who had seemed so passive and controllable moments before now loomed over him like an avenging angel, every inch of his bearing radiating disciplined authority and barely contained power. "Sir, you need to step back immediately and follow us," one of the security officers commanded Brad, his voice professional but carrying an undertone that suggested compliance was not optional. "You violated security protocols and disrupted a ceremonial post. This is a serious matter that requires immediate attention." The crowd began to murmur and shift, phones appearing everywhere as tourists realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. The incident was being recorded from multiple angles, and within minutes it would begin spreading across social media platforms around the world. What had started as Brad's attempt to create entertaining content for his friends back home had become an international incident showcasing the power and dignity of British military tradition. Mitchell slowly returned to his ceremonial position, his breathing controlled but his eyes still alert for any further threats. The intervention had been textbook perfect, swift, decisive, and proportional to the violation. He had defended his post and upheld the honor of the Queen's Guard without compromising his duty or abandoning his position. The centuries-old protocols had worked exactly as designed, protecting both the institution and the individual soldier. The veteran who had spoken up earlier approached the barrier with obvious approval. "Well done, soldier," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of one warrior for another. "That's exactly how it should be handled." His words carried special weight, representing the approval of previous generations of soldiers who had faced similar challenges in defense of duty and honor. Brad Thompson was led away by security officers, his family trailing behind in various states of distress and embarrassment. As they disappeared into the administrative areas of the palace complex, other tourists began to discuss what they had witnessed. The consensus was clear. The American tourist had gotten exactly what he deserved, and the guard had responded with appropriate force and dignity. The incident had lasted less than 5 minutes from beginning to end, but its impact would be felt for much longer. Mitchell had demonstrated why the Queen's Guard was respected around the world, why the position required genuine soldiers rather than actors, and why certain lines should never be crossed. His response had been a masterclass in controlled force, professional discipline, and institutional authority. As the crowd slowly returned to normal tourist activities, Mitchell settled back into his ceremonial posture. But something had changed in the atmosphere around his post. The tourists who remained viewed him with newfound respect and understanding. They had seen behind the ceremonial facade to the genuine soldier beneath, and they understood now that they were in the presence of real military authority, rather than tourist entertainment. The morning sun continued its climb across the London sky, but the day had already become historic. The confrontation between a disrespectful tourist and an elite soldier had ended exactly as centuries of military tradition dictated it should, with dignity triumphant and duty upheld, regardless of the personal cost. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the palace complex like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Within minutes of Brad Thompson's removal from the ceremonial area, senior officers were reviewing security footage and conducting preliminary assessments of the incident. Sergeant Mitchell remained at his post, outwardly calm and professional, but internally processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Colonel Hartwell, the commanding officer responsible for Queen's Guard operations, arrived at the scene within 20 minutes of receiving the initial report. A decorated veteran with 30 years of service, he had seen every type of incident imaginable during his career, but the growing international attention this particular confrontation was receiving made it especially significant. His first priority was ensuring that proper protocols had been followed, and that his soldier had acted appropriately under the circumstances. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Hartwell said quietly as he approached the guard's position, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also the respect due to a soldier who had upheld his duty under extreme provocation. "Report on the incident involving the American tourist." Mitchell's response was crisp and professional, delivered without breaking his ceremonial posture or compromising his ongoing duties. "Sir, the tourist violated the security perimeter and approached within physical contact distance of my position. After verbal warnings were ignored, I issued direct commands to withdraw, which were immediately complied with. Security personnel took control of the situation at that point, sir." The colonel nodded approvingly. Mitchell's account matched the security footage perfectly and demonstrated exactly the kind of measured response that the Queen's Guard was trained to provide. There had been no excessive force, no loss of composure, no abandonment of duty, just the precise application of authority necessary to neutralize a security threat while maintaining the dignity of the position. Meanwhile, in the palace security office, Brad Thompson was facing the full weight of British law enforcement and diplomatic protocol. The offense of interfering with a Queen's Guard was taken seriously by authorities, not just as a security breach, but as an assault on one of Britain's most cherished institutions. The duty officer explained the charges he was facing, the potential penalties, and the process that would unfold over the coming hours and days. "Mr. Thompson," the security chief began, his tone professional but stern, "you need to understand the seriousness of what occurred out there. The Queen's Guard are not performers or tourist attractions. They are active duty soldiers performing a vital security function. Your actions constituted a breach of palace security and disruption of military operations. These are serious offenses under British law." Brad's earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding of the magnitude of his mistake. His wife Sarah sat beside him, alternating between anger at his behavior and fear about the potential consequences for their family. Their children waited in an adjacent room, their vacation now transformed into a nightmare that would affect them for years to come. The incident was already spreading across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. Videos recorded by tourists showed the confrontation from multiple angles, and the footage was being shared, commented on, and analyzed by millions of viewers around the world. The hashtag #RoyalGuardNoMercy began trending globally within hours, with the vast majority of comments supporting Mitchell's actions and condemning Brad's disrespectful behavior. News organizations picked up the story with remarkable speed, recognizing the human interest angle and the cultural clash it represented. British media outlets praised Mitchell's professionalism and restraint, while international coverage focused on the broader issues of tourist behavior and respect for local customs and traditions. The incident became a case study in cultural sensitivity and the importance of understanding the significance of historical institutions. Back at his post, Mitchell was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere around him. The tourists who had remained in the area after the incident showed a markedly different attitude, more respectful, more understanding of the serious nature of his duties. Parents used the opportunity to teach their children about military service and the importance of treating soldiers with respect. The incident had become an impromptu lesson in history and civility. The veteran who had spoken up during the confrontation approached the barrier again, this time accompanied by his wife and grandchildren. "That was perfectly handled, soldier," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "You honored the regiment and the tradition. Well done." His grandchildren looked at Mitchell with newfound awe, understanding that they were witnessing something much more significant than a tourist attraction. Colonel Hartwell completed his assessment and prepared to brief his superiors on the incident. His report would note Mitchell's exemplary conduct under extreme provocation, his precise adherence to protocols, and his successful resolution of a potential security threat without compromising his ceremonial duties. The sergeant had demonstrated exactly the kind of professional excellence that made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. As the morning progressed, the diplomatic implications of the incident began to emerge. The American embassy was notified of the detention of a U.S. citizen, and cultural attachés began working to ensure that the incident didn't escalate into a broader international issue. However, the overwhelming public support for Mitchell's actions and condemnation of Brad's behavior made it clear that this would be resolved as an individual case of poor judgment rather than a cultural conflict. The psychological impact on Mitchell was more complex than the administrative aftermath. While he felt vindicated by the support of his superiors and the public, he also understood that the incident would define his career in ways both positive and challenging. He had become the face of Queen's Guard authority and professionalism, but he had also lost the anonymity that was traditionally part of ceremonial duty. Emma, his girlfriend back in Yorkshire, called him during his break period, having seen the videos online before he could even tell her what had happened. "James, are you all right?" she asked, her voice mixing pride and concern. "The whole country is talking about what you did. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself and your duty, but I was scared watching those videos." Mitchell's response reflected the complexity of his situation. "I did what I was trained to do, what any guard would have done. The tourist crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and I responded appropriately. But I never wanted this kind of attention. We're supposed to be part of the institution, not the story itself." The incident had transformed a routine day of ceremonial duty into a defining moment that would affect everyone involved for years to come. For Mitchell, it was validation of his training and commitment. For Brad Thompson, it was a harsh lesson in the consequences of disrespect and cultural insensitivity. For the institution of the Queen's Guard, it was a powerful demonstration of the continuing relevance and authority of centuries-old traditions in the modern world. The global reaction to the confrontation exceeded everyone's expectations, transforming a single tourist incident into an international phenomenon that sparked debates about respect, tradition, and cultural understanding. Within 24 hours, the videos had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, generating commentary from military experts, cultural critics, and ordinary citizens around the world who felt compelled to share their opinions on what they had witnessed. British television networks led with the story on their evening news programs, featuring interviews with military historians who explained the significance of the Queen's Guard and the protocols that govern their behavior. Retired Colonel Margaret Sinclair, a military analyst for the BBC, provided context that helped viewers understand the gravity of Brad Thompson's actions. What many people don't realize, she explained, is that these guards are active duty soldiers who have often served in combat zones. They're not performers or tourist attractions, they're professionals doing a serious job that requires extraordinary discipline and training. The response from the military community was overwhelmingly supportive of Mitchell's actions. Veterans organizations issued statements praising his restraint and professionalism, noting that he had demonstrated exactly the kind of measured response that distinguished professional soldiers from untrained individuals. Social media groups dedicated to military service shared the videos with commentary that highlighted the discipline required to remain motionless under such provocation before responding with appropriate force. International coverage took on different tones. Depending on the cultural perspective of each nation's media, European outlets generally supported Mitchell's response and criticized Brad Thompson's behavior as an example of the ugly American tourist stereotype that embarrassed more respectful travelers. Asian media focused on the cultural aspects of the incident, drawing parallels to their own traditions of respect for authority and ceremonial duties. American media coverage was more complex and divided. While many outlets condemned Brad Thompson's behavior and praised Mitchell's professionalism, others questioned whether the guard's response was proportional to the offense. Talk radio hosts debated the incident for hours, with callers sharing passionate opinions about military authority, tourist rights, and cultural sensitivity. The story became a proxy for broader debates about American behavior abroad and the importance of respecting foreign customs and traditions. Brad Thompson himself was experiencing the full force of internet infamy. His social media accounts were flooded with thousands of critical comments from around the world, forcing him to delete his profiles and retreat from public view. His employer back in Ohio, a regional insurance company, received so many complaints that they placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review. The vacation that was supposed to be the highlight of his family's year had become a nightmare that threatened his career and reputation. Sarah Thompson struggled to manage the family crisis while dealing with her own feelings of anger and embarrassment. Her husband's behavior had humiliated their entire family on a global stage, and she faced the difficult task of explaining to friends and relatives back home why Brad had acted so inappropriately. Their children were particularly affected. Madison refused to speak to her father, while Kyle seemed traumatized by witnessing his hero figure reduced to a figure of international ridicule. The legal proceedings moved forward with typical British efficiency and thoroughness. Brad was formally charged with disrupting ceremonial duties and breaching palace security, offenses that carried potential fines and even imprisonment depending on the severity of the court's judgment. His lawyer, appointed through the American Embassy's assistance, advised him that his best option was to plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court while expressing genuine remorse for his actions. Meanwhile, Mitchell continued his duties with characteristic professionalism. Though the attention made normal guard duty impossible, tourists specifically sought out his post, hoping to witness the famous guard who had become an internet sensation. Palace officials had to implement additional crowd control, measures to manage the increased interest and ensure that Mitchell could perform his duties without constant disruption. The incident also prompted broader discussions within the British military about tourist management and guard protocols. While Mitchell's response had been perfect according to existing guidelines, the global attention it received highlighted the need for clear communication about the serious nature of the Queen's Guard's duties. Educational materials were developed to help tourists understand that these were real soldiers performing vital security functions, not entertainers hired for their amusement. Cultural experts used the incident as a teaching moment about the importance of research and respect when visiting foreign countries. Travel blogs and guidebooks began featuring detailed explanations of Queen's Guard protocols, helping future tourists understand the appropriate way to appreciate this historic tradition without causing offense or creating security incidents. The veteran who had defended Mitchell during the original confrontation became something of a minor celebrity himself, appearing on television programs to discuss military service and the importance of supporting active duty soldiers. His dignified response to Brad's insults resonated with viewers who appreciated his defense of military honor and tradition. Emma, Mitchell's girlfriend, found herself thrust into the spotlight as media outlets sought interviews with people close to the famous guard. She declined most requests but did speak to one military family magazine about the challenges of dating someone in such a high-profile position. "James has always been dedicated to his duty," she said, "but now everyone knows who he is. It's changed our lives in ways we're still figuring out." The incident's impact extended beyond the immediate participants to influence broader discussions about social media, responsibility, and the permanent nature of online content. Brad Thompson's moment of poor judgment had been captured and preserved forever, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of inappropriate behavior in an interconnected world where every action could potentially be recorded and shared globally. As the days passed, the story evolved from breaking news to cultural phenomenon, generating academic papers, documentary proposals, and even merchandise featuring Mitchell's image. The sergeant found himself at the center of discussions about tradition, respect, and the role of military ceremony in modern society, all stemming from his split-second decision to defend his post and uphold his duty when confronted with unprecedented disrespect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic and straightened his towering bearskin hat. At 28 years old, Mitchell had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, a position that demanded unwavering discipline, perfect posture, and absolute silence while on duty. His dark eyes scanned the growing crowd of tourists gathering behind the ornate iron gates, their cameras already clicking away at the spectacle of British tradition. Mitchell had earned his place among the elite guards through years of rigorous training with the Grenadier Guards Regiment. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches, his imposing figure cut an impressive silhouette against the palace's grand facade. The scarlet tunic, adorned with gleaming brass buttons and intricate gold braiding, had been pressed to perfection. His black trousers bore a sharp crease that could cut paper, and his polished boots reflected the morning light like mirrors. Every detail of his appearance spoke to the centuries-old tradition he represented. The tourists pressed closer to the barriers, their excitement palpable as they witnessed one of London's most famous attractions. Children pointed in wonder at the motionless figure, while adults whispered theories about whether the guards were real people or elaborate statues. Mitchell had heard it all before during his countless hours of duty. The speculation, the jokes, the attempts to make him laugh or move. It was all part of the daily routine he had learned to tune out completely. Among the crowd, a family from Ohio had positioned themselves directly in front of Mitchell's post. The father, Brad Thompson, a heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a loud Hawaiian shirt and baseball cap, seemed particularly amused by the guard's stillness. His wife Sarah tried to shush their 2 teenage children, who were already making faces and silly gestures at Mitchell, hoping for any reaction. The family had saved for 2 years to afford this European vacation, and Brad was determined to get his money's worth from every tourist attraction. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger and more boisterous. Tour guides led groups past the guards, explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard, while tourists snapped photos and recorded videos. Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing controlled and measured. This was more than just standing still. It was a meditation in discipline, a testament to military precision that had been honed over generations. The Queen's Guard tradition dated back to 1660, and Mitchell took pride in being part of this unbroken chain of service. These weren't costume performers or actors. They were active duty soldiers who had proven themselves in training and often in combat. Many of his fellow guards had served tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones. The ceremonial duties were just one aspect of their military service, and the discipline required was genuine and hard-earned. Brad Thompson, however, saw only a man in a funny costume playing dress-up for tourists. He nudged his wife and pointed at Mitchell with a smirk. "Look at this guy," he said loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Must be nice getting paid to stand around and do nothing all day. I bet he can't even move in that ridiculous outfit." His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his words. Sarah Thompson felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She had read about the Queen's Guard before their trip and knew these were real soldiers, not performers. "Brad, maybe we should just take our pictures and move on," she suggested quietly, tugging at his sleeve. But her husband was already warming up, emboldened by the chuckles from other American tourists who found his commentary entertaining. The morning shift change was still 2 hours away, and Mitchell settled into the mental zone he had perfected over years of guard duty. He focused on his breathing, on the feeling of the ground beneath his feet, on the weight of his rifle. The tourists' voices became white noise, a meaningless backdrop to his meditation. He thought about his girlfriend Emma, who was finishing her nursing degree back in Yorkshire. He thought about his younger brother who was considering joining the army. He thought about anything except the growing agitation he could sense from the loud American tourist directly in front of him. Other guards had warned him about tourists like this, the ones who seemed to take the guards' silence as permission to push boundaries. They usually started with harmless jokes and comments, but some escalated when they didn't get the reaction they wanted. Mitchell had witnessed such incidents before, and had seen how quickly situations could spiral out of control when tourists mistook military discipline for weakness. The palace security cameras captured every angle of the courtyard, and Mitchell knew that his conduct was being monitored not just by tourists but by his superiors. Any break in protocol, any reaction to provocation, could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from the prestigious position. The Queen's Guard was expected to maintain dignity and composure under all circumstances, representing not just the monarchy but the entire British military. As the crowd continued to grow, Mitchell noticed other guards at their respective posts around the palace grounds. Each stood with the same perfect posture, the same unwavering focus, the same commitment to duty that had made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. They were brothers in arms, united by their shared dedication to excellence and service. Whatever was about to unfold, Mitchell knew he could count on their support and understanding. The morning was still young, and already Mitchell could sense that this would not be an ordinary day of guard duty. The American tourist's voice was getting louder, his comments more pointed, and the crowd was beginning to take notice. Mitchell remained motionless, but every instinct honed by years of military training was telling him to prepare for something that would test every aspect of his discipline and professionalism. In the distance, the changing of the guard ceremony was being prepared, but that was still hours away. Until then, Mitchell would stand his post, protect his position, and uphold the honor of the Queen's Guard, no matter what challenges the day might bring.